Okay, so in the interest of being timely, because I think that's such an important thing for us to do, I'd like to welcome our attendees and those who are watching this by recording to the Thrive webinar sort of monthly updates. Delighted today to introduce Olivia Louise Hamilton, who is here to talk to us today about suicide first aid. So Olivia, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mo. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today. As Mo said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about suicide first aid. So my name's Olivia Louise Hamilton. Olivia or Liv is absolutely fine, but my full name's there if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. My pronouns are she and so. Just a little bit of sort of housekeeping, admin, I guess, before we get going. We are going to be talking about suicide first aid and therefore suicide today. So want to remind you all that we're all unique. We all have very different experiences, backgrounds, and therefore different thoughts and feelings. So just something I think to bear in mind as we are having a look at this topic, which can be quite emotive, but nonetheless a very, very important one. With that also in mind, please think about your well-being as we work through. Suicide is a really important topic. It's something that we shouldn't be afraid of talking about, but it is an emotional one. It's a difficult one. And so whilst this session isn't going to be sort of diving into real sort of specifics, we will have a look at some definitions, we will look at some statistics. And so that might bring up some uncomfortable thoughts, memories or feelings for you. So just please be mindful of how you're feeling as we work through. Please know that you don't have to sit here and put yourself through it if you're feeling uncomfortable. You are very welcome to opt out at any point, and you're also free to leave. As it says on the slide, this is designed to improve your well-being, not to detract from it. So with all of that in mind then, I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about myself, my background, how I've sort of ended up here with you guys today. I'm also going to go on to talk a little bit about suicide, its prevalence, its link to neurodiversity. I also thought I'd share a little bit of my knowledge with you guys to take away. So we'll spend a little bit of time busting some common myths around suicide, and I'll provide you with some of my top tips for talking about suicide. I'll also tell you a little bit about the suicide first aid programs I offer, as well as the tutor training, in case that's an avenue that you guys would like to explore. And as always, if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to dive in. I understand the chat box is live, so I'll keep an eye on that in case there's anything that you want to sort of add or comment on. So my name's Olivia. I'm the founder or founding director of Changing Minds Training, and I founded Changing Minds with the vision of making mental health an everyday conversation in the workplace and beyond. So why did I do that? A lot of my reasons for founding the business boil down to my lived experience. So I've had quite a long history of mental illness. I was diagnosed with an eating disorder as a young teenager. Sadly, I made my first suicide attempt around the age of 12. I spent about 18 months caring for a family member in my sort of mid-teens, and that family member was dealing with substance abuse, and we were having very regular episodes of quite severe self-harm and also suicide attempts. After that, I went off to university at 18 and my mental health began to decline. I returned to some of my old coping strategies, so self-harm, suicide behaviour as a means of coping. And I ended up dropping out of university because my mental health was just so poor. I moved back home and I was diagnosed with something called borderline personality disorder after multiple suicide attempts. I had some really fantastic therapy and intervention after that diagnosis, and I made a really, really good friend during one of my therapeutic groups. Now, sadly, I lost her to suicide a few years ago, and we were not able to talk about how she died because of the community that she was from and the stigma that surrounded suicide in that community. So over, I guess, about a span of 15 years or so, I've had a lot of exposure to poor mental health and mental illness. And what I really noticed over that time was really the silence, the lack of support, how people really sort of shy away from talking about suicide. If we have some sort of physical health crisis or emergency, people generally tend to know how to respond. They want to, follow up and check in. And I found with mental health and specifically suicide, that just wasn't the case. So what I did next was I decided to work in mental health as I began to recover. I worked for a community mental health service. So we supported people who'd been sectioned for quite long periods of time, and we helped them in their transition back into the community. So helping them become more sort of independent. I then moved from there to an inpatient psychiatric facility, and I did a little bit of work for Shout, the crisis text line service. And from there, I then moved into the emergency ambulance service, Southeast Coast Ambulance Service. Now, really enjoyed all of those roles, got an awful lot of experience from them, but I just felt like I wasn't making the changes that I wanted to see. I saw a really huge gap in prevention and just general awareness, even within the mental health settings that I was working, or health settings that I was working. Nobody wanted to talk about mental health and suicide in particular. So this is where I came into my training journey. I was Googling away on one rainy night shift at CCAM, came across something called mental health first aid. Didn't really know what I was going to do with it, but I thought that sounds right up my street. So it started out as a bit of a passion project, and it just grew and grew and grew. And I specialise now in workplace wellbeing training, and that's again largely due to my lived experience. As I mentioned, there was a real lack of support. People just didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. And actually, I had one person who was my manager when I was at the ambulance service, who was a really key catalyst in my recovery. And it was ultimately because she took the time to find out a little bit more, to ask those difficult questions, to work with me to implement a reasonable adjustment. And it was honestly life-changing at a time where I was very, very close to losing my job because I'd had so much sickness due to my difficulties. So I've also experienced the power of that support in the workplace. Work was a big protective factor for me, and being able to stay in employment was enormous. So I do a range of different trainings, courses, workshops, usually a little bit different to the one that we're doing today. This is a little bit out of my comfort zone. I'm not used to doing webinars. The training that I offer is usually a lot more interactive and lots of sort of facilitated discussions. So I do a range of the Mental Health First Aid England products, both the adult and the youth. I deliver suicide first aid training, which I will talk a little bit more about. Obviously, I'm a Thrive instructor partner, and I'm also a hypnotherapist in training at the moment. So a few strings to my bow. Now, because of all of that experience, one of my specialist areas of interest is suicide. So as I said, I'm going to spend the next, I suppose, 20 minutes or so talking to you about what suicide is, about its prevalence. We'll link it to neurodiversity. I'll share some of my knowledge to bust some of the common myths around suicide and provide you with some tips that you can take away if you are having these conversations. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about suicide first aid and other training opportunities. So, definitions then, I thought this would be a helpful thing to cover, and we'll also touch on sort of language and stigma a little bit here as well. So suicide is the act or an instance of intentionally killing oneself. So suicide thoughts are when someone feels that they can no longer go on living. They might think, I don't want to be here anymore, I'm a burden. Those sort of thoughts that a person might have when they feel that the demands outweigh their resources to cope. Suicide thoughts turn into suicide behaviour when those thoughts turn into planning, preparing, or executing. Now, the language that we use when we talk about suicide is really important. And whenever we use language, it has the ability to increase or decrease stigma. And as you'll probably know, there is a huge amount of stigma surrounding suicide. One of the terms that we often hear is someone committing suicide. And that is a term that we find no longer to be very helpful. The term commit is related to, a crime, a criminal offence, or a sin. Suicide, you may or may not know, has actually not been illegal in the UK since 1961. So that term commit is a little bit of a hangover from when suicide was illegal. So it carries a lot of that stigma, it holds a lot of that stigma. So it's far better for us to talk about suicide in a manner that's more neutral. Someone has died by suicide, they've ended their life, they've attempted suicide. You can also use suicide as a verb, which I'm aware does feel a little bit strange if you've not done so before, but you might say that a person has suicided, for example. Whilst we're on language, the other thing that we tend to come across that can be quite unhelpful is when we talk about suicide attempts as failures or successes. And I personally, in the past, when I've heard that language being used, when I've heard my suicide attempt being spoken about as a failure, what's gone through my mind is I couldn't even do that right. I couldn't even in my own life right. So you can see that those terms failure or success, they come with the notion that it's gone well or it's gone badly. So again, this tends to be quite unhelpful. It's far better for us to say that somebody has attempted suicide or they've died by suicide. You might even say that somebody has attempted suicide with the outcome of life or the outcome of death. But those terms failure and success tend to be quite unhelpful. So let's have a little bit of a look at some sort of statistics. So across the world, one person dies by suicide every 40 seconds. The latest statistics we have for the UK in terms of reported suicides are for 2022, and they're sitting at about 5,600. When we look at suicide behaviour, that's actually more common than death by suicide. So approximately 40 to 100 times more than those that have died by suicide will make a suicide attempt and survive. What's even more common than suicide behaviour is suicide thoughts. Research tells us that about 5% of the population will experience thoughts of suicide at some point in their life. That means that about 1 in 20 of us. And that also means that thoughts of suicide are more common than a heart attack. You're more likely to come across someone experiencing thoughts of suicide than experiencing symptoms of a heart attack. And for me, I think that really highlights how important this work is. Now, it's really important to note that suicide doesn't discriminate. It can affect any of us from any background, culture, race, religion. It doesn't discriminate. However, there are some groups of individuals that are at greater risk, and that includes those who are neurodiverse. So there is actually very little research on the link between neurodiversity and suicide. It's quite limited. There's a lot of work to be done there, but I have managed to find a few statistics for you that I hope really highlight the link between neurodiversity and suicide. So for example, autistic adults, they are 9 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for autistic people. Autistic children are 28 times more likely to attempt suicide, and 15% of autistic children have had thoughts of suicide compared to about 0.5% of neurotypical children. And there are lots of reasons, I guess, behind why there is this increased risk that I am not going to explicitly cover today, because as Thrive Instructor Partners, you will know all about the stigma and the difficulties that neurodiverse individuals face, and that's ultimately what is contributing towards this increased risk. So let's spend a little bit of time busting some myths. There are some really common myths and misconceptions around suicide that I come across. If we were in person today, I would give you a version of that photo up there as a sticker, but we're obviously not all together in one room. So just know that I would love to give you a sticker if I could. Everyone loves a sticker. So let's go through a few of these then. Now, one of the biggest myths that I come across is this idea that if we ask someone about suicide thoughts or a plan, we will encourage the person to end their life. Really, really common fear is this idea of planting a seed, giving someone an idea that they don't already have. And actually, there is no evidence to support that this is the case. All of the clinical and anecdotal evidence from all over the world support the opposite. If we ask someone about suicide thoughts, that will actually often lower their anxiety level and it will act as a deterrent. The crisis and the resulting emotional distress will have already triggered the thought in that person. And actually, your openness and your concern will allow the person experiencing that pain to talk about their thoughts, and that might reduce their anxiety. It might also allow the person to feel less lonely or isolated and perhaps a bit relieved. So if you only take one thing away from today's webinar, it is this. It's that asking about suicide thoughts does not encourage the person. It opens up that supportive chat and it allows us to support them. Second one that I tend to come across quite frequently is this idea or myth that people who talk about suicide, they don't take their own lives. Sometimes I hear people say things like, well, if they were going to do it, they just do it. They wouldn't talk about it. And actually, talking about suicide is a really clear signal that someone is considering that as an option. Most people who take their own lives, they give signs or signals towards their thoughts or their behaviors. Most people will be a little bit more, I guess, ambiguous in their language. So they might say things like, I don't want to be here anymore, or I think I'm a burden, or I don't want to wake up. But other people will be more direct and they may say, I'm thinking of ending my life. I'm thinking of killing myself. And that sort of direct speech around suicide is a really clear sign that a person might be considering suicide as an option. So I guess what I want you to take from that is that all mentions of suicide should be taken seriously. And that includes, sometimes people will make jokes, people will use jokes or humour as a way to manage. So I would say even in the case of perhaps a joke being made, that's something that I'd want to investigate further. So the final one on there then is tied to the myth that once a person is seriously considering suicide, there is nothing we can do. And that isn't the case. Most suicide crises are time limited and they are often based on unclear thinking. Most people thinking of suicide, they don't want their lives to end. They want the pain that they're experiencing to stop. And so with proper assistance, with support and timely recognition, they actually may never act on those thoughts or even have thoughts of suicide again. So I hope that's been a helpful little sort of few nuggets of information for you. Next, I'm going to give you some of my top tips, I guess, for talking about suicide. So the first thing that I would say is to be very aware of your own attitudes and your own beliefs. If anybody's done any mental health first aid training, you might recognise the term frame of reference. So this is really what I'm talking about here. Whenever we have conversations, specifically conversations about suicide, we bring with us to those conversations all of our own attitudes, ideas, and beliefs. So if we've had sort of experiences in the past that maybe give us a stigmatizing outlook on suicide, or maybe we have a belief that it might be selfish, or we can't understand it, all of that stuff comes with us. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do if you want to be able to talk about suicide is to spend a little bit of time exploring your own values, your own attitudes, your own beliefs. And it isn't necessarily about changing those, but it's about being aware of them so that you can set them to one side, because we really need to be non-judgmental when we support people. The second thing is don't be afraid. Try not to panic and appear confident. I know that sounds easier said than done, but it's so powerful. That creating of a sort of calm environment and appearing confident can be really reassuring for the person that you're supporting. So it's a little bit like physical first aid. If someone's bleeding profusely and we run in, it's flopping around, oh my goodness, there's blood everywhere, we're going to really exacerbate that situation. Also, if somebody does reveal thoughts of suicide to you, there is no need to panic, because they are just thoughts. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person's going to act on those thoughts. And actually, the fact that they've opened up to us is a really, really good sign. So even if you're really panicking under the surface, which is totally normal, try and keep that nice sort of calm and confident exterior. The third thing is a really simple one, and that's just to thank the person if they open up to us, if they disclose those thoughts of suicide. Some sort of acknowledgement or validation here is really helpful. So thank you for telling me, that was brave. We really need to talk about this. Something of that sort can be really, really powerful, just to recognise how difficult it is to open up about those thoughts and feelings. Now, whenever we're supporting anybody with anything, we want to consider confidentiality. We don't want to share any, private or confidential information with people that don't need access to that. However, with suicide, we do need to consider whether or not that applies. And the general rule of thumb is, if there is immediate risk to life, confidentiality doesn't apply. That being said, what I would always encourage is that we work collaboratively with someone who is thinking of suicide. So we don't want to take over where possible. We don't want to do things for them. We want to work together. So this is a bit of a balancing act, but it's important that we consider confidentiality and whether we do need to break that, or if we can work with the person to share that information with somebody else they trust. The next thing is a safety or a support plan. So this is something that we go into great depth in the suicide first aid training, but actually they're not as scary or as complex as they sound. And Papyrus have a really fantastic suicide safety plan template. So even if you aren't doing the training, you haven't done the training, this is something that you can take a look at, that you might be able to work through, or even just get a general understanding of. So safety support plans are vital to suicide first aid work, and Papyrus have a really good template of one. One of the most important things is also thinking about our well-being. So don't underestimate the effect on your well-being if you are having conversations about suicide, if you are supporting somebody through a suicide intervention. It can be really difficult and tiring and distressing and uncomfortable to learn that somebody wants to end their life, and to maybe even hear about all of the things that are happening in their life that is so painful that has led them to feel that this is the only solution. So self-care, time to rest, recharge is really an important part of, I think, modern life anyway. But when you are then thinking about supporting other people, particularly with big topics like suicide, it's just vital to have that time for yourself, to have people to talk to be able to reach out for support if and when you need it. So think about yourself, fit in your own oxygen mask first. And my final tip, of course, being a suicide first aid trainer, is to train in suicide first aid. I really believe that this is training that everybody should have. We know how common thoughts of suicide are, and they're just really, really vital skills that I really believe in. So I've just had a message pop into the chat box, which is about this term unalived. which you might have come across before. It's a term that people might use to describe death by suicide. And what this person has asked is if it's an acceptable term. Now, where this phrase has come from is actually social media. So in an effort to try and, I guess, improve online safety, social media platforms have put restrictions on certain language. So things like suicide, things like self-harm, which has meant that people talking about those things have had to use different terminology. So that's where that term unalive has come from. People have used the term unalive on things like Instagram and TikTok to get around those filters, because if they were to say something like suicide, their content would be blocked. So I wouldn't say it's unacceptable, but it's a little bit of an odd one. It isn't really, grammatically correct, and I would suggest that there are better ways to talk about suicide. But really good question. Thank you for raising that. So I thought then I'd tell you a little bit about the programs that I can offer you. So there are 2 core programs. That is the SFA Suicide First Aid, and that's a full day's worth of training. There is also an optional day 2 coming. I can't tell you any more about that at the moment, just a little teaser. And then the other is the Suicide First Aid Light, and that's a half-day course. So the key difference between those 2 are really the depth that we go into, as well as the full day giving you a lot more time to put those skills into practice. We spend a lot more time going into safety from suicide, how we safeguard, how we create a safety plan, whereas the light version is more of an overview. It's a bit more introductory. Now, as well as those, I also offer a couple of programs that are specific to different groups. So we have SFA Young Adult and we have SFA Children and Young People. And as they really say on the tin, it's the same sort of structure, but it's a lot more tailored to either the young adult or children and young people. So we are running a couple of open courses this year. We've got one coming up in March and then we've got another in October. We tend to run them over 2 Friday afternoons rather than a full day because it is online and it can be quite tiring. So if you are interested in the training, I know Simon has a code for you that will give you 50% off of our open courses. Similarly, if you might like to sort of refer any of your clients onto us, if you think that this is something that might be helpful for them, I can offer you a 20% referral fee. Now, there are some other trainings that I'd also like to mention. So maybe you don't have the time or you don't have the budget to invest in this. Zero Suicide Alliance offer a 20-minute free training sort of online module. As I said, it's free, it's 20 minutes. So if nothing else, have a look at Zero Suicide Alliance training. One of my colleagues, Rose Raukins, who runs an organisation called Start the Conversation, she's also developed a fantastic 90-minute training session. It's called Talking About Suicide 10 Tools Training. So that's another one that you might want to have a look at. And the final one that I'll mention that I'm not trained to deliver, but I have attended as a learner and is fantastic, is something called ASSIST. So ASSIST stands for Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training, and that one's a 2-day face-to-face course. And if that's something that you're interested in, I would highly recommend Grassroots Suicide Prevention as a provider. So finally then, perhaps my talk today has inspired you to become a trainer yourself. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Associate Tutor Training Programme. So you can qualify as a Suicide First Aid Associate Tutor. It involves a 5-day course. So 4 of those days are part of a national tutor-led programme. To qualify, you'll have to complete a reflective journal, a written assignment, and then the day 5 is an observed delivery. So again, I can provide more information about this if anybody is interested, but my experience of going through that training was brilliant, really well supported. The sort of resources and support post-training that I've had have also been brilliant. So that is suicidefirstaid.uk. You can find the tutor application on there if you're interested. And if you pop myself down as a referrer, that would be absolutely wonderful. So really that takes me to the end of the content for today. So we have been obviously touching on an emotive topic. So what I'd like us to just do together is either close your eyes if you feel comfortable, perhaps just soften your gaze. And I'd like you just to have a think about something that makes you happy. What's something that brings you joy, that makes you smile? Really think about what that thing, place, person is, and the happiness that it brings to you. So if you're wondering what I was thinking of, this is my little Boston Terrier, Twinkle. She brings me so much joy. And I think after discussing difficult content, it's always important to close up on something that, brings us a little bit of happiness, a little bit of joy. So I really hope that's been helpful for you today. Please do reach out to me if you have any questions, if I might be able to support you in any way. And I'd love to see you on the training if you're interested. As always, these webinars are running on a monthly basis. So the next one is the 27th of March. It's going to be hosted by Chris Mullen, and it's all around an older experience of LGBTQ+. So get that one in your diaries if it isn't already. Other than that, just a big thank you for coming along today. Look after yourself, stay safe, reach out to us if I can help, if I can do anything to support. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you on some future training.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was not only interesting and informative, but also very personal. So thank you again. Hopefully some people will be watching this on the recording as well. Get in touch with Olivia through Thrive or through her LinkedIn profile or all the other ways that she's put on the slides. So thanks again, Olivia, and thank you again for everyone for attending.
Thanks all. Bye.